My name is Kyle Hibble, and I have the privilege of serving as president and CEO of Pomar Foundation on behalf of our trustees, a number of whom are here this evening, Matt Carpenter and Thayer Tutt. And I believe our chairman, Bill Hibble, was here earlier, but not anymore. I know that guy. We wish to welcome you this evening to this Forum for Civic Advancement event. And I can tell you, it is such a pleasure to see so many full and smiling faces with us here this evening. It truly has a great feeling to it. And there's a lot of pent-up demand to see and understand, what does the future of our community look like? And as many of you know, this is a Forum for Civic Advancement program. Pomar started engaging in the Forum for Civic Advancement in 2001, and the purpose was to engage and support those who are interested in the civic health of the Pikes Peak region. So we thank you for your interest in that. And this program is put together by a number of people, but in particular, the fellows who run our operating programs, in Megan Sanders and Dylan Craddock. Thank you for your work in doing this. Please join me in thanking them. We have with us this evening a number of elected officials, and we can save our applause until the end. We have Lojinos Gonzalez from County Commissioners, Stan Vanderwerf from the County Commissioners, and from City Council, Nancy Henjum and Stephanie Fortune. So please join me in welcoming them. In addition to that, Jeff Green and Bob Cope are here from the city and Colorado Springs Economic Development Management. So please join me in thanking them. Now at this time, it's really my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker this evening. And it's an individual who has been the state's demographer since 2004, a person who looks at population trends and economic trends. And we were talking briefly a minute ago, and she said, who knew numbers and were so exciting? But I believe tonight you will find it to be very exciting. So please join me in welcoming the state demographer, Elizabeth Garner.
Well, I am very honored to be with you guys tonight. I really appreciate being invited to be part of your program and hopefully help set some context for what we're seeing, not only today, but really when we're starting to think about the future and what will we be 5 years, 10 years down the road, and how can we think about that maybe differently or engage it differently. We've got a great panel set up afterwards, so hopefully I'm gonna set up some ideas and some thoughts about what we may discuss as a panel. I always like to talk about what are some of the big pictures, what are some of the summary trends that we see going on impacting the United States as a whole, and Colorado, to see then where does Colorado Springs fit into that picture. So one of the biggest trends that we're seeing is that actually population growth is starting to slow. I know you don't believe me. I'm gonna show you pictures. But a lot of it has to do with slowing in births and an increase in deaths just due to aging. We're also seeing migration and mobility start to slow down. I know, you don't believe it. But that is, Colorado's becoming a little bit more difficult to attract and retain people for, and it's therefore the labor market's a little bit tighter. So thinking about how do we adjust with that a little bit differently. We're also seeing a lot of concentrated growth in Colorado, kind of the bigger counties getting bigger, the smaller counties getting smaller. That definitely is a double-edged sword, right? For El Paso and Colorado Springs, whether you love the people or you're like, well, maybe somewhere else. But it's something to be thinking about, where do you fit into that picture? Aging, how many of you guys woke up a day older? We're doing this all the time, and there really is a true impact to the state and to this region and Colorado Springs, thinking about how we're going to face that and work with that differently in the future. And we're becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. And that's really important, especially from our young end, because that's where we're seeing a lot of growth is in our racial diversity at our youngest ages. So just to prove the point that really things are slowing down, and I do apologize for the blank. I'm gonna occasionally look back and figure out what you can't see that I can. But the biggest takeaway is that the US grew, yes, by 22 million over the decade. But what you don't know maybe is that it was the second slowest growing decade on record, second to the Great Depression. So if the US is slowing down, then that will impact Colorado. Over the decade, Colorado increased by 744,000 people, a 14% growth rate, so twice as fast as the US. So yes, faster than the US, but also for Colorado, it was one of our slower growing decades. But just enough for that 8th congressional seat and all of the drama, right? That was so much fun. Maybe more importantly is to look at the change this last year between 2020 and 21. The US grew by its slowest growth rate ever, an increase of 0.1. 17 states lost population. Colorado grew by 27,000. So if you look at the previous, the 744, that meant on average we were growing by 74,000 a year. We grew by 27,000 this last year, a 0.5% growth rate. Net migration 14,000, and our rank within other states fell to the second grouping, no longer in the top 10, but now in the top 20. If we look at a map of the state, and we look, red, orange, yellow is positive, all of the shades of blue is decline, this is where we grew over the last decade. The reds are, again, like the positive that I said, and you can see this concentrated growth of population along the I-25 corridor. So again, the larger counties got larger, the smaller counties got smaller. Of those counties that declined, there were 16, and the total amount was 7,200. So it's not like we're having a great out-migration, but it's a continual decline in a lot of the Eastern Plains, San Luis Valley, northwest corner of the state. It's important to understand the components of population change and what drives it. So we've got 3 pieces: births, deaths, and net migration. Births minus deaths is known as natural increase. That's represented by the blue component on this chart. It starts in 1970 and goes through 2021. The red component is net migration, the ins minus the outs. What you can see is that we kind of see this wave over time, especially with net migration. We had 5 years of net out migration during the 80s. We had a lot of growth in the 90s. And really, since 2001, we have not had growth over 100,000. Yet I bet that's not what you believe or hear in the media. And so part of this is context and communication, right? Is that we've got to be able to talk about factors and feelings better and honestly. If the fact is that we're not growing exponentially, if you remember your math classes, and then why do we feel uncomfortable? Right? We actually grew this last decade a little slower than what we were projecting. But why did we feel so bad? Was it because maybe we haven't kept up with transportation and infrastructure? Is it maybe we didn't keep up with housing? What is it? And these are maybe some of the pieces that we can talk about. But the biggest piece to see on that far right-hand side is the fact that we kind of hit a peak in 2015, and we've been slowing ever since. Net migration has slowed. Natural increase has slowed, all prior to COVID. If we look at El Paso County, and we don't do this by city, so we only do it for the county, same concept. Natural increase is that blue component, and you can see very solid, basically from 1985 on, a solid natural increase of 5,000. So your births minus deaths equaled right there at 5,000. But you can see how also net migration kind of went all over the place. But what you can also see is the recent 3 years, a slowdown. Now, again, this number is 2021 is the last one, and that is a July 2021 number. So I know all of you are saying, but what about all of those housing units, right? Well, we might not have counted that yet. It might be really in this next year for 2022. One of the biggest pieces to see in that, and I know I don't expect any of you to see that, but I knew somebody was going to quiz me. Well, how much did we grow by? And I wanted to be prepared. So we've got several panels here. The very last panel is the change from 2010 to 2020 for Colorado, El Paso, and then all of the communities within El Paso. I've got Colorado Springs highlighted there. So Colorado Springs increased by 62,000. A note that that was an increase compared to the previous decade, which is that 55,000. But what you'll also see on the far right-hand side is that percent change. So Colorado increased by that 14%. El Paso increased by 17%. Colorado Springs by 15%. So you can see where we're there. And then I also highlighted their Monument by 88%. So interesting to see kind of that dynamic within, and the red is where we saw a decline. Now, one of the biggest pieces that I've mentioned is that we've seen this slowdown in births, and it's been significant. For the United States as a whole, we are down about 1 million people under the age of 18 between 2010 and 2020. Let me just say that again. We are down 1 million people between the time period of 2010 and 2020 under the age of 18. So are we feeling a little tight in the labor market right now? Guess what? It's just starting. We have 1 million fewer youngins coming up. In the US, we've got 525,000 fewer births per year. Colorado, 8,000 fewer births per year. On this map, the blue shaded states are states that had an absolute decline in their under 18 population. Why should we care? California, regardless of what you think of them, I'm just kidding. My husband's a Californian. They fund our higher ed system more than any other state by paying out-of-state tuition. They've got an absolute decline. So is higher ed, look at this map and they're like, oh my heavens. Absolutely. You think about the Midwest, the Northeast, same idea. I was in Eagle County last Monday talking with them. University of Vermont is matching CU. All a student has to do is show them what their award was or is from CU, and University of Vermont will match it. Do we need to be slightly concerned about retaining our own kids and keeping our own kids? If you get a butt and a seat in another university, you've got a really high chance of keeping them in that university, in that state, and that makes a big difference in terms of looking about the labor force. So another thing that we can maybe talk about. If we look at Colorado, all of the red, orange, yellow counties are counties that had an increase in the under 18 population. All of the shades of blue decline. 43 of the 64 counties had an absolute decline in the under 18 population. Our under 18 population was only 38,000 growth over the decade. Of that 744,000, only 5% of our total increase was in our under 18. Weld County was 45% of that growth. So make nice with Weld County, because if we're looking for people in the future, that's where they are. If we look at Colorado Springs and El Paso, yes, an increase in that under 18 population. But I highlighted on that far right side, this last decade, there was a growth of 9,000 for the county and 3,000 for the city in the under 18 population. But the previous two yellows are where it was the previous decade, the growth between 2000 and 2010. So the increase in that under 18 fell by over half for the county and the city. Something to keep an eye on and thinking about what's the future of K-12, what's the future of higher ed. So we've talked about births and deaths. The next piece is net migration. So this is the net migration chart for El Paso County and the type of folks that you attract. It's broken down by single year of age. So who do you attract? You attract 20-somethings. That's your big bread and butter. What did I just say is going to be slowing down? So this is something to pay attention to now. What we're talking about is the future. This is something that you can plan for now, is this potential slowdown in that under 18 population. I also included up there kind of who your bigger donors are. So who do you get people from? Adams, Arapahoe, Douglas, Denver. So you attract a lot of folks from Metro Denver into the area. You also attract people from other states. You can see there Texas, Florida, Hawaii, Nevada, California, Illinois. But you also lose people, and that's listed up there as well. You know, we've got Larimer and Jefferson and Pueblo listed up there in those top group, but also to Kansas, Indiana, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, California. So you can kind of see who those trading partners are. Biggest question is, why do we typically migrate people? In the Front Range, I will tell you that they may be not as quick as Colorado Springs. I'm banking on it. They're like, you know, Elizabeth, I'm not a fan of people. And I'm like, oh, but I'm the demographer. This is what we do. And they're like, yeah, no, they're kind of on our roads, in our houses, on our ski slopes. I'm like, yeah, no, I get that. I'm like, but what do you think about jobs? And they're like, jobs? Love jobs. Jobs are awesome. And I'm like, but a job is a person, and a housing unit is where that job sleeps at night. How can you love jobs but hate people? So we need to understand that relationship, and that's what this shows is when we have stronger job growth, which is in the blue bars, we get stronger net migration, which is in the red line. So it's a good conversation to have on the future of Colorado Springs in this whole idea of job growth and population. Yes, also what brings people here, the colleges and the universities, the military, as well as commuters. People will live in Colorado Springs and commute other places. I know that seems absurd, but have you seen I-25? I'm sure you've been on 25. You know this, that it happens both ways. People come in and people come out. But that will create people here. Now, we know that COVID was rough, and I'm not going to go into economics. We've got some folks here that are much more expert in it. But the point from this slide is really showing the downturn, which is a blue, the upturn or the recovery in the orange. And I'm just checking to make sure you can see it. And what we can see is that, one, Colorado has recovered. We are at about 104% employment compared to where we went into COVID in February of 2020. So that's awesome. And the Colorado Springs MSA, which is all of El Paso plus Teller, is one of our fastest recovering areas. So congratulations, 117%. Number one was on the far right, Grand Junction, and you can see where everybody else is in that grouping with a little bit slower recovery for our non-metro areas, as well as the Greeley MSA. But the big question is, thinking about this into the future, is this relationship between jobs and population, and how do we all fit together? So let's talk about that housing thing. One of the biggest things we saw over the decade was that we actually didn't build as much housing as we have historically. And that surprises a lot of people. Again, most of the time people say, oh, it's all those people moving here that's creating the housing challenge. And I was like, what are you looking at? I'm like, it's the fact we didn't build housing that it feels uncomfortable. They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, we built 126,000 fewer housing units this last decade than the previous decade, yet we grew by more people. Does that make sense? If we look at this chart, the orange bars are housing unit growth annually. The black line is household formation. We can see we don't really do a very good job of pairing the two together. And that creates problems, right? When we overproduce housing, what do we have? We kind of slid into that Great Recession. That was so much fun. Then we stopped producing. You can see that for 10 years, we didn't produce at the same level. Yet we still formed households, still people to live in those housing units. But it's taken us forever to recover. That has led us into being the 4th highest median home price in the country, yet only the 12th highest median household income. So does that make it harder for Coloradoans? Absolutely. Colorado Springs, we don't have it specifically for Colorado Springs, but we do have it for El Paso County. Same idea. You can see the big trough when we stopped building. From 2000 to 2010, we built 50,000 units. From 2010 to 2020, we built 34,000 units. Yet our population increased by more this last decade. So a lot of this constraint that we're feeling isn't because people were flocking here that we had no idea would come. Fewer came than we thought, and we built fewer housing. So we've got to really work on that communication. So I've mentioned a lot of these pieces. The other part that's really hard is this whole idea of public will. NIMBYism, anti-growth, anti-density. How do we have this conversation together and move forward, as well as talking about water and infrastructure, all on this supply side? On the demand side, guess what? It gets worse. We already know this whole idea about jobs equal population equal housing. But what about also the idea that we're aging? Guess what? I'm going to age out of the labor force. I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying in my house. And the next state demographer, she's not living there. And I am going to be one of 600,000 people in the labor force now, aging out over the next decade. Last decade and this decade combined, a forecast of 1 million people aging out of the labor force. We thought the housing market was tight now. Just wait. Same, millennials are aging into not only prime home buying, but second home buying. Gen Z are entering into the housing market. People have more money. They didn't travel, they didn't get married, so they've got more money to buy houses. And then we've got a weird thing in the Denver metro area, and I'm curious if it's happening here. These investors, institutional investors, buying up housing and keeping it vacant just to take advantage of the home price appreciation. There's a company out of Texas that bought in Denver proper, bought over 500 units in 1 quarter to hold. Now, housing is meant for housing, not just to sit there vacant. Likewise, the cannabis industry is holding a lot of their dollars in housing as well. It's a lot safer than their pillow or mattress. The banking system doesn't exist to support that industry. It's a lot of money and a lot of people, and they're in the industry of cannabis, not in the industry of being a homeowner or being a landlord. Next, I'm going to finish talking about age and aging. Biggest piece is that we should always know our age. We know that. We look in the mirror every morning, right? As a community, we need to understand who we are because it affects everything we do. Our preferences, what we like, what we don't like, where we're going to shop, how much money, if we're in the labor force, what kind of housing, all is dependent on age. So this is Colorado's age distribution broken down by single year of age. At the far right, we've got our silent generation, then we've got our baby boomers in the purple, our Gen X in the green, our millennials in the red, our our Gen Z in the blue, and our future generations in the brown. Black line is at 65. Our peak person's about 29 years old. You can see on that far left-hand side the slowdown in that young population. On the far right-hand side, you can see a lot of people aging into that 65 plus. Fastest growing age group in the state for the next decade is that 65 plus population. Here is El Paso's age distribution. Same idea, same colors, huge peak at 25. Purple, you can see a lot of people aging into the retirement age, the baby boomers aging into that. But again, you can also see on the far left-hand side, the slowdown in that young population. So over this next decade, what are we forecasting for the state as a whole? We are forecasting an increase in those older populations, but not very much in the younger age. Very flat in the 0 to 17, flat in the 18 to 24. Some growth in that 25 to 44, but only if we can migrate them here. And really the fastest growth in that 65 plus. If you look at the numbers below, what you'll see is that we're forecasting a growth of about 716 total over the decade, about 314,000 in that 65 plus. That's about 43% of the total growth in the state forecasted in an age group that typically ages out of the labor force. A lot of times people are like, well, where are they all coming from, Elizabeth? I'm like, look in a mirror. We don't migrate a lot of older adults, we just age. And we need to be able to look at this strategically and understand how we are going to accommodate this into the future. So here's the forecast for El Paso County. Same idea, pretty flat at the youngest ages, a little bit stronger than what we've got for the state as a whole. Definitely stronger in that 25 to 44 because you saw that net migration and what kind of folks you typically attract. But really that's just based on net migration, if you can attract them here. Your 65 plus, yes, still the fastest growing age group, not the total largest age group. But this is something to be thinking about, is how do we strategically plan for it? Lots of implications, as I mentioned before, this is gonna impact consumer demand, it's gonna impact your labor force, housing, as I've mentioned before, as well as this whole idea of services for older adults, which is something that we may wanna talk about as well. People can only stay here if they can stay here. If there aren't the services to help support them, they will leave. And your older adults tend to have the most wealth of all age groups. This is a group that actually we like to see age in place. One, they're cool. Two, and they're cool, come on. Two, I mean, they really create an important economic driver for a community. And they don't tend to boom and bust like other industries do. They just continue to exist. They're, like I said, they're cool. So it's something to be thinking about also, how do we support our older Coloradoans? Last thing I'm gonna mention is really race and ethnicity and the fact that we're becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. If you look at this table, what you can see is the very bottom line says 240,000. We increased by 744,000 over the decade. 240,000 of that growth was our white non-Hispanic population. So about a third of our total population increase were white non-Hispanic. That means 2/3 of our population growth were people of color. And so that's important to see, that we have got a strong growth in our people of color in the state as a whole. If we look at our under 18 population, again, we only increased by 38,000. Our only increase was our people of color. We had an absolute decline in our white non-Hispanic. Why does this matter? It really matters because there is huge educational achievement differences. There's huge preparation differences. And we need, like I said, we're gonna have fewer folks altogether. We need everybody to be super prepared. And that means that we need to dedicate more resources to make sure everyone is successful moving forward. If we look at Colorado Springs, similar components in terms of about 30% of the total growth was in the white non-Hispanic, meaning about 2/3 in our people of color in Colorado Springs, an absolute decline in our white non-Hispanic under 18. So our only growth was in our people of color. So you hopefully have taken away from this, what we really see in Colorado is the fact that our youngest population is the most diverse. Our under 18 population is about 43% people of color. Our oldest population is about 16% people of color. So our future is really dependent on a much higher concentration of people of color. And Colorado needs to actually do a better job. We haven't been doing as good a job as other states have been in this area. Huge importance for our labor market, huge importance for our market. So I think I hit all of those. So what are we forecasting? We're forecasting, again, Colorado to slow down. Still grow. So this is the conundrum. We're going to grow, but slower. So we're not going to get the bang for the buck necessarily, but we're still going to be growing, but at a slower rate. Migration slowing down. How do we manage that? How do we look at that differently? Net migration's down, international migration's down, cost of living has an impact into the future. Biggest question is, will we be able to attract and retain? Work from anywhere certainly is a double-edged sword, right? It is super cool, isn't it? Not to have to drive all the time. But that means people might not stay here all the time. Jefferson County is looking at hiring people out of state to hold positions. State of Colorado, still you have to live here. That's I still have to be, which is cool. I like Colorado. But the biggest question is, will we still be able to keep people, let alone attract and retain, if our cost of living is as high as it is? So we're forecasting into the future, hopefully, a bounce back in migration, because I'm going to be honest with you, I want to retire. I need somebody to come in and fill my job. Not today or tomorrow, but a couple of years. Don't count me out quite yet. But slowing out into the future in migration as well as natural increase. But an increase in the population, an increase from that 5.7 million to 7.5 million. So that's 1.8 more million people. So that's the question. Are we going to embrace the love? Or what? Are we going to be thinking about population growth? If we look at that 1.8 million, what are we forecasting for the Colorado Springs MSA, which is bigger than just Colorado Springs, it's El Paso and Teller, is 266,000 over this time period from 2020 to 2030, or 2050. That would be scary if it's 2030. So I'm not going to read all of these or even mention them because I want to get into the panel. Biggest piece is we're seeing this slowdown, and the biggest impact really is going to be on the labor force. Huge impact on labor force into the future. And so some of the questions are, how do we really attract and retain? It's going to turn everything on its head in terms of what we've traditionally seen with businesses and people. It is going to be so much more labor-driven or employee-driven than firm-driven. And looking at how do we manage that and how do we deal with that, as well as how are we more strategic in that, and how do we look at bringing people from the sidelines into the labor force, whether it's keeping older Coloradoans longer, how about younger earlier, how about formerly incarcerated, what about different abled? So looking strategically of how do we embrace labor force differently. Finally, with housing, I won't get into that as well, but we need to be thinking about keeping up that supply, at least in the short run. And how do we do it, and how do we talk about it? How do we think about it in terms of aging? Because again, like I said, I'm not giving up my house. And there's about 500, 600,000 others not giving up their house for that next worker. So thinking about how do we do that out into the future. So with that, I won't go on to the risks, so we'll talk about that, but I want to thank you guys for paying attention. You guys were super. Thank you for inviting me to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the next part of our session. So thank you guys very much.
You're welcome to take a seat there if you want to. Thank you, Elizabeth. Who here loves data? Yes, and Elizabeth knows how to bring it to life. Thank you so much. I hope you do not retire anytime soon, so keep up the good work, greatly appreciated. For those that I have not met, my name is Matt Carpenter. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Pomar, and happy to get us on to our next session, which is our panel. So panelists, feel free to come on up, get to your comfortable seats, and I will introduce you. So first off, we are fortunate to have Johnna Kleymeyer, who is the President and CEO of the Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC. Johnna's been here, took over the position in 2021. Glad you are here, has a wealth of knowledge, and you're gonna be perfect in moderating this. So thank you, Johnna, for doing that.
Thank you.
Also joining the panel with Elizabeth, we have Tatiana Bailey, who is our director of the UCCS Economic Forum, and also has a wealth of knowledge about data. We have Aikta Marcoulier, who's the executive director of the Pikes Peak Small Business Development Center, and actually has a new title, it's long, the Region 8 Small Business Administration Regional Administrator. Congratulations on your appointment by the Biden administration. We hope, Aikta, you remember us here in Colorado Springs. Thank you.
I still live here, play here.
Excellent.
Part of the community.
Work remotely, but from Colorado Springs. Thank you. We also have Eric Phillips, who's a business owner and economic development specialist, among other things. Thank you, Eric, for joining us. And finally, we have Tony Rosendo, the CEO, founder, and partner of Spur Philanthropy. Thank you, Tony, as well. Johnna, it's all you.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's really exciting to see that so many of us in El Paso County and Colorado Springs care about the future and where we're headed as a community. So let's dive right in. I'd like to ask the panel, from your perspective, what has been the most significant change in Colorado Springs over the last 10 years? And when I say Colorado Springs, I mean El Paso County and Colorado Springs. Tony, why don't we start with you?
Thanks.
You're closest to me.
Well, first, a disclaimer, because I'm sitting by myself. Breaking. Yes, sir.
You can't move.
How about now?
Yeah.
My joke is now no longer relevant because it took too long. Punchline's gone. I was going to say I'm by myself because I'm the layman of all of these experts here. But I have been in Colorado Springs a long time. And so one of my biggest observations is the attitude. When I came to Colorado Springs in 1998, and something that I felt for a long time was just a sort of laissez-faire attitude towards Denver, this kind of stepbrother or cousin attitude towards Denver. And suddenly in the last 10 years, I felt a can-do attitude and a progressive nature of being able to build infrastructure and invest in ourselves. And so I think that, if you saw, the articles about Blue Dot Place and, when construction and residential downtown was being built, we then quickly noticed a progression of developers wanting to invest in Colorado Springs, outside developers taking a position that we hadn't seen in previous time. And now as you look across our city, you're seeing lots of new residential built, and we're exceeding our expectation of those residential units, which will then spur a number of different economic development attitudes, as well as, grocery stores and parks and things of that nature. But I really love what Elizabeth said, just in terms of what is our position and the ethos of how we control our growth, and do we create a culture of proactively looking at that growth versus passively. Thanks.
Love it. Eric, what's the most significant change that you've seen in Colorado Springs and El Paso County in 10 years?
I'm sorry. Testing. Okay. Kind of the same as Tony. I came here, veteran. I was in the military in '89. I left and then came back, and everything was just growing slowly. But then it started to grow faster. I served on the planning commission for 7 years and saw how the city started to grow smartly. And that's what it's been about. People here are great. I'm from Cleveland. No jokes, please. But
I'm from Cincinnati. I have no idea what you're talking about.
But this is a great place, and I think we continue to grow. We can continue to grow, but do it in a smart way.
Aikta.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here today. So over the 10 years I've been in this role for almost exactly 10 years. So I really look at this question from the small business perspective as the local SBDC director. But to start off with, we have been growing like crazy, and my husband wants to move to a tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere in Alaska. He's like, get me out of the city, where I'm like, keep me in the city. This is an amazing opportunity to be a part of something big. What I've seen in the business community, and I'm going to see a lot of friends' heads shaking here because it's so great to see all of the business community here, is 10 years ago, we did not work together. 10 years ago, the silo word was big, right? The chambers weren't working together. The SBDC wasn't working together. We were all doing our thing. But I will tell you, the leadership in this town has grown so positively in the last 10 years, where we'll talk about a little bit later, but we're crossing roads. We're crossing those paths that have never been crossed before to ensure our small business community is being supported the best that it can be. We've gone through 4 disasters now. When I took my role, Waldo Canyon Fire happened. How many people remember that? Unfortunately, we can't forget it, right? And it affected some of us more than others. Black Forest Fire happened, the floods happened, and now we're in this pandemic, which has been unprecedented. It is through those times that I know our community has come together so well, so closely. Demographics or not, place or not, this is when we've come together to really support one another. So I'm going to start off with that positive note, because I know when it comes to stats, you can really go downhill sometimes. But from what I've seen with the demographics changes, with the growth of minority populations, I'm obviously a minority, I'm a woman, and I'm a spouse of a veteran. So check all the boxes, check all of them down the row. But we've come together to support those communities, and those communities have come together to support us as well through all of this. So just something I really wanted to point out over that last 10 years, which I think has been really great.
Dr. Bailey.
Thanks, Johnna. Well, I've been here 7 of the last 10 years, and I'd say that 2 things that stand out to me. One is that when I moved here, I was told all we have are military and call centers and a lot of old people. And you know, I said I wouldn't have moved my whole family to that kind of a community. It's definitely got more going on, and it's only going to improve. And thankfully, that's come to fruition. The thing that, from an economist standpoint, too, is that a lot of that growth has been diverse. We've had, yes, diversity in racial ethnic groups, but also diversity of industries. And that's, any economist will tell you that's a good thing. You don't want all your eggs in one basket. So, for instance, in the dashboard, for those of you who picked it up, on the second page, I have what are the top growing industries? And you can see professional and technical. We have construction, we have healthcare. We've got a wide array of different industries that are growing. And that's exactly what you want. And honestly, that's part of the reason that, Elizabeth's graph is almost the same as mine for the percentage of jobs that have been regained for our area. We had a lot of professional jobs that never went away. Our construction industry was booming and was deemed essential during the pandemic. So all of these things really, have contributed. And my numbers are a little bit better than yours, actually. Mine are 120% of our jobs have been regained, but I count a little differently than CDLE because I count self-employed, which I think is really important, or very, very small businesses. The other thing that I would say really stands out, and I'm stating the obvious, is the increase in the cost of housing. So usually it takes about 20 years for the median price of a home to increase, and it happened in 11 years here, so twice as quickly. When I moved here, we were cheaper than the median home price compared to the US. Now we're about 25% more expensive than the median home price in the US. And Elizabeth did a great job talking about how that impacts particularly young people moving here, right? But here's the sort of bad news of it all, and that is that our our average wages are lower than both the US and Colorado. We're 14%, we make on average less, 14% compared to Colorado, and about 9% compared to the US. So, when I moved here, people said, well, that's okay because we're cheaper. Well, that's not the case anymore. So those are some of the things that I look at as an economist in terms of ensuring that the few people who we have who are going to be working age, because that is declining, are able to come here and stay here.
Excellent. Elizabeth, would you add anything else? You had great remarks about Colorado Springs.
Yeah, no, I mean, not anything super additional. I mean, I don't know the spirit. I don't know the community like you guys do. I only know the numbers, so that's the very sad part. But what you can definitely see, I think it was rough coming out of the Great Recession. Colorado Springs and El Paso County was one of the slower to recover. But you hit like 15, 16, 17, 18, really started seeing things take off in terms of both job recovery, job growth, as well as housing growth. And definitely like what you would hear people saying in terms of a spirit of people loving Colorado Springs, loving El Paso. And I'll just a little kudo. I was here last week, stayed the night in Colorado Springs, downtown. It was so fun. And
we agree.
A ton of restaurants and places to go. So I hadn't been there in ages, so it was great.
Well, welcome to town. We've got a lot going on. Yeah. Well, I'll just add from the Chamber and Economic Development Corporation's perspective, from a macro level, I see Cecilia Harry in the room, who's our Chief Economic Development Officer. It is busy. We have so many companies looking at this area, and just in the past 3 months, we've added 4 companies, and I think this is significant because 2 were tech companies, 1 was defense, and 1 was manufacturing. And so the diversity of the economy, I totally agree, Tatiana. We're seeing that. And 1 was a foreign direct investment. So again, this bringing companies in is always a good thing. So Tatiana, broadly speaking, to what extent, we know that we heard from Elizabeth that we're going to see some growth and maybe slow down, but what would be your opinion on the growth of Colorado Springs in the next 10 years? Do you think do you feel it's going to slow down?
Yeah, I mean, Elizabeth and I go back and forth quite a bit. I've always used her numbers because she's so good at what she does in terms of my own population projections. We've had a little more conversation recently because I'm looking at all of the permits for multifamily and single family homes. And, and to Elizabeth's point, it doesn't quite jive, right, with these population numbers. And yet we do know that we have 1 million fewer children, right, under age 18. And even for the state of Colorado, we're going to continue to see a slowing of population. And that is definitely a problem. But I also think that we have to look at it as an opportunity. By the way, I'm from University of Michigan, Wolverine, you Ohio Buckeyes. I moved here in 2014. I brought 5 Wolverines with me, okay? 5 kids. One of them's even here. But when you look at also, we're the second most educated state in the nation, right? So that also actually means lower fertility rates. So that, people typically, who are educated have fewer children. So when I put all this together, you have a shrinking pool of people, and yet we have the blessing of robust business growth, right? So how do you reconcile that? The only way you can reconcile that is to really make training accessible, post-secondary education. You have to have strong K-12. You got to educate kids as early as middle school about what these high demand occupations are. And that's why I strategically put it on the front page of this economic dashboard, because those top 10, 20 job openings are always the same. They don't change. And that's telling me that we're not training people adequately for the jobs of today. Now, the good news is that most of those jobs have livable wages, but we don't really provide the access, the easy access. And again, to Elizabeth's point, if we have a lot of racial ethnic minorities who are even more compromised often in their ability to pay for that higher education, it's not going to work. Because that is our increasing proportion of our working age people moving forward. So I think that we have to be, as I stated on the call, intentional about looking at these trends, as Elizabeth also said, and saying, how do we solve this problem now so that we can continue to have the beautiful, robust growth that we've had in the state and in the region?
Absolutely. So we've identified affordable housing, sustainable job growth, and ensuring that growth is inclusive for all as major topics of interest. Let's spend a minute on each of those. Tony, I'll start with you. Have you seen the demand? How have you seen the demand for housing impact the region? And maybe particularly if you have any thoughts about water. Let's just solve world peace while we're here too tonight. So, yes.
I can't even figure out my mic, so I got nothing. The housing market is skyrocketed. I mean, I think if you look in some odd ways, right? You look at the slowdown and you go, thank goodness, right? Because of food insecurity, housing, affordable, attainable housing, and how do we actually balance out a growing market? And so in a lot of ways, as the market increase is happening, I think what we do have, to answer this in a bit of a different way, is an opportunity to actually find ways to achieve an affordable, attainable housing sort of balance in some ways, because we can do it cheaper now than we will be in the next 10 years with some of this growth that is still happening for us in Colorado. Second, with water, I think that, conservation as well as urbanism often get bifurcated. So you're talking about, let's protect our low grass prairies. And then you're, talking about urbanism in a kind of different way. In my mind, if we could talk about urbanism and conservation in the same kind of chapter, then we can start talking about density and ways that we can use water in a growing world and in a growing region and in different ways. And so I think, not to throw out dirty words such as, urban boundaries and some of those things that, in Colorado we don't love to hear, but how do we think about density in a different way and control of growth sprawl so that our water resources are used more effectively and more efficiently over time, especially, again, also I want to know, where are my Gen Xers? What happened to us? In that graph, we were just not doing well. So
yeah, no, we were known as the baby bust originally. That's what we were called. And then they called us Gen X. Yeah, no, the few but mighty.
Well, I think we're awesome. So, yeah. Eric, maybe you could speak to, how have you seen the demand for affordable housing impact the region?
So I serve as a planning commissioner for Colorado Springs Housing Authority. And of course, we've seen demand for affordable housing while our waiting list is still long. But I want to give you a couple of numbers because I'm not sure if most of you know what we do. Okay, so we serve low-income families, disabled, and seniors. And I just want to give you some numbers so you kind of see what we do. Our housing programs, Section 8, we have over 2,000 vouchers for Section 8. Conventional public housing, we have 706 units. Low-income housing tax credit purchases, 1,800. CHS owned, 813. So we have a total of 5,755 units. Extremely low income, we serve 30%, and this is Colorado Springs. Voucher Section 8, 77%. We serve handicaps at 48%, and we're still growing, we're still building, if you knew. We're still working with other builders to build lower income housing. So it is hurting us, but the great thing about it is that we have land to expand. Unlike some of our competitors that don't, we do have land to expand here. So yes, it's growth. Yes, it is hurting, of course, But I still think if we do it correctly, we can make it work. So.
Thank you. Tony, I'm going to take it back to you for a moment because this also can be a negative word in some aspects about gentrification with all this demand. What have you seen have been the housing impacts and gentrification, especially in our downtown area?
Yeah, so we're in a conundrum here, right? So on one aspect, you've got a city that in 2015 hadn't built a lot of residential downtown for over 50 years, or even looking at commercial properties. That wasn't a large development. Alamo Building, I think, was built in 1970s. And so in one aspect, as a citizen and as an investor, you're looking at, how do we continue to populate and grow now that we haven't had this growth over 50 years? How do we transform this into the next Colorado Springs of tomorrow? At the same time, juxtaposing and conflating with an issue of affordability. And so, not to overuse the word of intentionality, but how do we get outside of these and out front of these issues before they become a problem? And then we do it unintentionally, creating big box solutions to a local issue that we feel is much more close to heart, as opposed to just, I look at some of the projects that we've been involved in and Pomar has been involved in, of making sure that we keep our local flavor to projects and not just, sort of selling our precious lands to larger developers. Not that I dislike the larger developer, but there's an intentionality as opposed to a passive nature of letting people develop your land and your communities. And so I think it is a matter of, as we look at these growth numbers, something that wasn't kind of overlaid into the ethnic minority growth and the disparity there is not just about education, but also about income. And so, when we are seeing folks that historically have been in, lower income communities, we can't just pretend that magically on one side we've got a growth inflation of people who look like me, but that can't afford these housing markets that are coming this way. And so how do we grow programs and grow a development criteria that allows for that affordability while not doing it? I think that one of the challenges as you look even internationally is that often these marginalized populations, the development process that you're looking at is way too low in terms of the investment in that infrastructure. And you can make money, right, on developing affordable housing, but you don't have to make like gobs and gobs of money in affordable housing. And so how do you make that a balance and a ethos of where you can support those through, private-public partnerships? And there's great examples across the country, but, the challenge also is going to be like, how long do you hold those properties, and how long are you willing to support those populations until you find buoyancy? Because a 15-year hold on a LIHTC deal can sometimes go sideways when people are looking at how much money you can make on the back end.
So Elizabeth, I want to stay on housing for a moment, and you talked a lot about the aging population. And one thing at the Chamber we've been looking at for best practices is possibly could we find partnerships with our faith-based community that have available land for aging population or for low income. Have you seen best practices, or do you have thoughts on the housing demand for aging population and what maybe we do?
No.
Okay.
I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm not. We've got a division of housing in our department, but I think the big picture to take away is that with our aging adults, we've got all sorts of. Some of them are super wealthy, some of them are not.
You can have my mic, because not the only one.
Technology is great when it works. So. Oh, you can't set a water bottle in front of it. That's what they told us. It blocks the line. Stand on one foot, hold your hand up.
Hello. Okay. is just to remember that we're all sorts of different people, all sorts of different situations. I do know that what's hard is that a lot of people want to be able to age in place and age in their community. And those aren't a lot of opportunities when we've built subdivisions and areas. They're all houses that are very, very similar. And so if somebody wants to downsize, they often have to leave their community. And that's really hard. And so trying to come up with some strategies to where you don't have to leave your community, or when we're looking at new developments, making sure that there's all sorts of different types of products within a community so that you can do that effectively. Because otherwise, I'll make fun of my mom. My mom doesn't want to move. And she is still in like a 4,000 square foot home living alone at 85, but she loves her neighborhood. And I call her a waste of a housing resource.
Sure, you're
so
no Christmas
inappropriate,
for you.
inappropriate, but I'm her daughter, so I can say it. But you know, that house should have 5 people in it, not 1. And so that's another challenge that Colorado Springs, Denver, all will have, is how do we move forward as we're aging and that supply of housing resources and wanting to age in place and age in your community.
Well, just a little plug. I know that the Chamber and EDC and the Home Builders Association, Apartment Association, Low Income Advocates, Downtown Development, a whole group have been working for the past 18 months on ideas and solutions just like that. They're presenting on Monday to City Council and then to El Paso County later in the month, to give ideas at the local, the state, and the federal level. Just like your mother, could we transfer her Homestead Act credits to a smaller home so she doesn't stay in the 4,000 square foot home? So yeah, there's all kinds of ideas. So I want you to know there's positive things happening. I don't want us to be too negative here. So Tatiana, anything you would add to that?
I think I need your mic, actually. Yeah.
Wow.
There we go. No, it's all good. Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I'll add to that is, especially, people like us look at this and we kind of knew that this was coming with the demographics and such, but of course with the pandemic, it became that much more apparent, right? So all of a sudden, in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, it was, on the front page. And the National Association of Realtors and a couple of other large associations related to real estate did some analyses on what is this housing shortage? What is the delta that we're talking about? Are we talking about 500,000 homes in the US or whatever? And it's actually pretty easy to figure out. I looked at their methodology and they all come up with somewhere between 6 and 6.8 million dwellings. That's a lot of dwellings, right? And to your point too, I mean, in wealthier states and regions, you also have people buying second homes. My husband and I are going this weekend to look for our second home. So, anyway, but someone will live there, I promise. So, but I did the same analysis for El Paso County because I was really curious. And this is, a legacy of the Great Recession, right? Lending standards got tighter for individuals and for builders. A lot of builders went out of business. So the industry just, like really almost collapsed in a lot of ways. And now we're paying the price, right? And of course, people who don't want to move. And what I found was we are just about 12,000 dwellings short. That can be a single family home, that can be an apartment, that can be a condo. Those are homes, households, and the average is about 2.5, 2.6 people per household. That's a lot. Now remember, that's a cross-sectional look. So that's if today nobody else moved to El Paso County, we'd still have a shortage of 12,000 units. Some of these initiatives that we're looking at, for instance, some of the best practices that you've seen in other areas, one of the most promising ones I saw was a community that said, all our teachers are leaving. They don't make enough money. We're getting too expensive here. So they worked with the builders to build a community of teachers, literally like a subdivision of teachers, which apparently they also really liked, just being in a community of young people and the kids playing together and so forth. And also how we build. We build houses the same way that we did 75 years ago, and that needs to change. And, a lot of you may have seen like the modular homes that are becoming more popular and so forth, including in Colorado. So it's in all of the above. It's also the rezoning and the filling, right, of urban areas. So when we think about this, we do have to think in terms of what is the delta, which is around 12,000 for El Paso County. Where do we need that housing? Who are we trying to accommodate, right? Usually it's your younger, professionals or non-professionals who are trying to get a start somewhere, and then work really closely between government and private in terms of how to meet that need.
Thank you. Let's switch gears. Let's talk job growth. Aikta, we have let you be quiet way too long. And especially we need to hear from your expertise. We've heard from Elizabeth about the potential impacts to our labor market. And so from your perspective, what does the future of job growth look like and what should we be paying attention to?
Mm-hmm. So coming from the small business perspective again, and I don't want to speak for you, Eric, there's a number of things that may seem a little fluffy when we talk a lot about data, but it's really the trends that we're seeing in that next pipeline or the people that we do need to hire, whether there's enough of them or not. But there is some things that small businesses particularly need to be aware of or paying attention to. So that's the area that I think I'll be focusing on. Unlike large companies, small businesses have the opportunity to be flexible, to create new programs, to create new incentives to work for them. The one thing that small businesses are not able to do all the time is to pay those higher wages. When we look at the moms and pops and businesses 35 employees or under, it's a bit harder to do that. So small businesses need to be innovative, creative, and come up with some new flexible options. Some people hate that word. Some of us that have been doing it for a while, but flexibility is key. So one of the things that we're focusing a lot on is that our small businesses have the opportunity to really revolutionize the way working looks. So as we look at job growth and what opportunities there are, if you're the person with the opportunity, there's some other options to recruit those possible people to work for you. And again, a little bit fluffy, but very important because this is what the next generation is looking for. You need to have purpose in what you do. There needs to be a mission for your business. There's a sense of accomplishment that our Gen Zers are looking for. They're looking for, and I'm looking at our demographer to see if she's agreeing with me, Elizabeth. But the data is showing that that Gen Z, 16 to 25 years old, entering the workforce, they're not looking for necessarily the paycheck. I mean, I still am. I'm an ex-millennial. That's where I'm going to put myself. I'm at the end of the Xers. Or Gen Y, call me what you want, but I won't take the X because I'm right in the middle. But they're looking for something a little bit different. And there is something to be said about having purpose with the business that you're running or the corporation that you're running. It doesn't have to be small. Really, there needs to be a sense of purpose, a sense of accomplishment. What is that person, where is that employee gonna go next? What does the job growth look like? How will they succeed? And then also that connection to one another. I can't stress enough how important it is for our next generation that believes in teams, believes in working together, believes in a sense of that purpose. So I think it's really important when you're looking at job creation, workforce development, creating that next pipeline for your industry. These are things that are standard across the board for that generation entering the workforce, no matter what industry that you're in. The other thing I want to mention is when we talk about workforce, we forget sometimes to talk about those sole proprietors, those LLC holders, right? Because it's not necessarily always added into the stats. So entrepreneurship is a thing. That's why they have me on the workforce board for 9 years now, because we have to make sure that we talk about entrepreneurship. Our Gen Zers are 62% more likely to be entrepreneurs. So while we may have trouble filling jobs, know that there may not be trouble starting new businesses or the desire to start new businesses. It's really, really important that our communities, our cities, our municipalities, our chambers, which we are doing here, are focusing on how we're supporting the entrepreneur and those dreams and accessibility of becoming an entrepreneur too. We talked a little bit about ethnicity, minority populations, but also our rural populations. They have accessibility issues. So as we're trying to support what that next generation looks like and how they're supporting our economies, we have to also look at accessibility, which is like a whole nother topic, which we could all probably talk about for another hour or two. But I think in general, as small businesses, we do need to pay attention to this generational difference, this demographics difference, the growth of our ethnic populations. Because if it always looks the same to you, you're gonna be weeded out really fast. You're not gonna find the right people to work for you or upskill to work for you, whatever we talk about here, because our next generation is looking for something completely different than what any of us have experienced.
Well, and you're talking about that with entrepreneurs, I have to give a plug. I've worked in a lot of states, and our small business development center here is top notch. So if you know someone that's wanting to start a business, hats off to I totally agree. Yes.
Thank you.
And we have Exponential Impact and Catalyst Campus. So we have groups working in this space, which is encouraging because we need the spectrum of
yeah. Well, and if you look at the increase in businesses that have started here, we actually have had one of the least amount of business closures through COVID, like at 28% compared to other similar metropolitan cities. We've actually had lower decline. We've actually had more growth than we've ever seen. Normally during economic downturns, that's when people look for entrepreneurship. So then in return, you see the growth of Exponential Impact, the growth of what Catalyst Campus is doing, SBDC scores, Women's Business Resource Centers. You'll see a lot more happening in those areas for a reason, because there's a need.
Absolutely. Eric, would you add anything to that? Anything else we should be looking for, watching in the market for job growth?
I totally agree that our workforce is different. I own I don't know if I should do a shameless plug.
You should do it.
I own Three's Comedy Club downtown Colorado Springs, and we opened in the middle of COVID. And not only was that a challenge, but the workforce was a challenge. And it's a service industry, you have food and beverage. But I think that some of our young people don't look for the same things we used to look for. You know, when I was 16, 17, it's like, I gotta have a car right now. And it's not that way. They can ride a bike, they can do Uber. So they tend to, they don't need much, it seems like. And that's okay. But like Aikta was saying, if you give them incentives and work with them, they'll work for you. So it is different, but the small business community here, again, is great. We stick together, we do things, we work with each other, and that's something I haven't seen before. So I think we have something good growing here in the small business community, and we will have some people that will enjoy coming to work, especially downtown, because we're downtown and we see the growth downtown. So.
Excellent. So we heard from Elizabeth's presentation that really the demographics are changing, not only in El Paso County and Colorado Springs, but across the state. Tony, how do we ensure growth is equitable and inclusive for our entire population?
I promise that there's not going to be like a punchline every time I talk, but I want to invite you to every event that I speak at, because I just look at you and I'm like, something's happening good. So you're invited. You get to come. Sorry. I think that it's a matter of overused word, intentionality, and how do we do things that are equitable, But we have to decide as a population, what are we trying to do? Do we want everyone here? Do we want to hoard our resources? Do we want to take our little acorns, like the, cartoon that my kids watch? I have young kids, and we're just taking the acorn and keeping it? Or are we going to decide that we want a better population for all? And I think that, our next iteration of where we go is going to be a society that looks at, everyone's well-being. And I think that the more, it's crazy what's happening in the world, and not to get too political, that's, I can't believe my 7-year-old, one of my biggest things that I've just had aha moments on is having a 7-year-old kid who knows what's going on in the world, and hearing repeated back to you from the mouth of a 7-year-old about wars and about scarcity and about, your next door neighbor and sharing and being nice. Tear to your eye, he was like, why does Russia want to take over Ukraine? They're so small. And I was like, oh my God, you little, sweetheart. There's so many political things you don't understand. But at a basic level, how do we look at sharing our resources across a world and a country and a state and a city and looking at that equitable, portion. I don't think that that's a flowery or very academic response as I look at our different academias up here, but I think it's an ethos. It's a way of looking at how you operate in the world, and it's either a scarcity model or an abundance model. And do we actually think that we can give up one of your acorns so that someone else has an acorn? So that's my uber sophisticated way of explaining that. So.
I understood that though, so that's good. Thank you. I appreciate it. Eric, would you add anything to that?
No, I think he said it all.
Think
with
he's good?
acorns.
Okay,
Yeah, acorns.
good. Well, a theme that we've heard from several of you tonight is intentionality in growth. What would that look like to you? Please, any of the panelists. Sounds like a fancy word. So what does that mean? None of you want to take it. Okay.
We're fighting, we're safe. You go.
I don't think I want to go.
Well, I think in addition to the whole thing of saying, okay, do we want to share this pie? How do we share this pie is a big part of it. But I also think it's, I'm a data person, so I think a lot of it is also just informing yourself and really understanding what are we talking about, for instance, with a labor shortage. So I think it was April 10th, so 2 Sundays ago, I had an article in the Gazette about the labor shortage and the role of demographics, because it's such a hot topic now. And it's interesting to me because you talk to some older demographics, usually they're not always older, but they say, it's all these people who have left the labor force and they just need to come back, and we need a good hard recession, and that'll bring everybody back. But I'm with you, Aikta. Like, I talk to my kids, work is different. Mm-hmm. It's a whole different thing. And, you can say, oh, they're spoiled or they're this. And, the reality is there are fewer of them. And their mindset is different than the boomers, than the Gen Xers, and so forth. So we have to think about that aspect of it, but also the absolute numbers. So, in this article, it's crazy, but we have 11.3 million job openings in the US. We have 6 million unemployed. So if you do the math, it's 5.3 million, right, that we're short. Just those positions have little to no chance of ever being filled. We don't have the bodies, right? And then even if those people who left the labor force came back, you'd add back in about 1.5 million people, okay? That's also assuming that the skill sets match, which we know that they don't. That's been a problem for a long time. So again, you do the math, and we still have, even if all those people came back, even if they all had the right skill set, we still have a shortage of about 4 million workers in the US. So one of the things I think about is we used to have about 1 million immigrants that came into the United States, and in 2017, the laws changed. And now we're down to about 360,000. Those are your lowest skilled and your highest skilled workers, and we need them all. So one thing that we can be intentional about is allowing immigrants who really built the country in the first place to be able to come in legally and fill some of these jobs, because we need them. We need them desperately. So that's exciting. I mean, my parents are immigrants, and, I look at, I'm a first generation Latina graduate, who ended up even with graduate degrees because my parents worked hard and came here and, succeeded. So those are some of the things that I think we need to look at, again, prospectively, to deal with some of these challenges that we're going to have, because who doesn't want jobs and economic growth, right?
Their people is what I heard. That's right. Jobs and homes. Others on intentionality and growth. Aikta, how would we work together on that?
Yeah. So again, small business perspective, I feel like an outlier at times because we're doing a lot of data, but through the pandemic, we saw how small businesses that were hit hard really affected our economy, right? We saw that those closures, the inability to have those places to go that really create that vitality and culture of our communities, when that was gone, a lot was gone. And one of the things we talked about as we reviewed what we wanted to talk about on this panel was intentionality of growth, yes, but how we as a community talk about who we are. And that is part of growth. That is part of representing who Colorado Springs is, or El Paso County is, or Teller County is, wherever you're from here, representing those areas. It's important that we talk about, when we look at the growth of the small business community, which has been very, very large here in the Pikes Peak region, we can't ignore that and only focus on the recruitment of other large companies. It is incredibly important that we work on that, and that's why we have the amazing Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC. But we also have to have a balance. There has to be a balance in supporting and growing local. How many of you are small business owners? I'm sure there's lots of you here, yeah. So how are we creating the next thing that's putting us on the map? How are we supporting local after the pandemic? How are we creating the incentives or creating the voice for a local small business community? And some of that is with how we're talking about who we are. Large business likes to come here when we have culture, when we have vitality, when we're bringing in younger populations that want to do things, right? If there's nothing to do, no one's going to come here. And guess what the things are to do are created by? Our small businesses, right? And so one of the biggest things that I personally am working on really hard is that our media talks a lot about Amazon, talks a lot about Shields, talks a lot about the big business that comes to town. We need to change the voice as a community to support our local businesses and celebrate the ones that have survived and the ones that are continuing to grow. Otherwise, we're going to lose our bombs who are looking at Denver right now as their new location. We need to work on creating incentive programs and that voice to keep them here. So we need to be intentional about the companies that become big because they all start off small, right? I have a lot of passion for this, if you can tell. But no, you can't tell at all. But we got to support the 3 East Comedy Clubs because they're the next big thing nationwide, right? They're the next ones that maybe will franchise and be that next freaking Whataburger or In-N-Out Burger, right? Go to Bingo Burger instead, please. Thank you. Go to something like that. Support local. But we have to be intentional about our actions, how we talk about our community, and how we talk about, our growth and if we are working on housing and all the things, sorry, I'm getting the timeout thing. But if we're talking about housing and growth and all of those things, we have to also talk about, we have to include this other piece. If we're building this, we also need to build this because it's all supporting our economy and keeping the dollars here rather than paying it to Amazons or Shields, and that money's going somewhere else. We need to keep our dollars here because every dollar spent here changes hands 7 times.
Well, on that note, because I think that's a good one, what can our audience members do to stay informed on city growth and have a voice in the direction of the city and county? I'd like to ask each of you that. And maybe I'll just even extend it, Elizabeth, to have a voice at the state.
Yeah, when we were like, I don't know. So obviously at the state level, being involved with your state representatives, I am in. Understanding what policies are taking place, getting actively involved, being an active participant, understanding the different impacts. Certainly, even what Tatiana was saying about international immigration, that's something where you need to be hitting your representative, your senators, because that's something that has to be decided at the national level, not at the, it doesn't typically happen very locally. But definitely being involved with, finding out what city council is doing, finding out where they're investing in different programs and projects, understanding this whole piece in terms of being, supporting local agencies. I think that's really important for people to hear what you care about and really the decisions that you're interested in. And, a push that, again, I would say, and think creatively. This is the best time. Anytime there's scarcity, we get to be creative. And that's what I think everybody should be engaged and encouraged to think about, being creative. How do we increase labor force participation rates at all different age groups? How do we bring in people from the sideline? Really thinking strategically about different abled and formerly incarcerated. They have the highest unemployment rates and the highest or the lowest labor force participation. How do we look at that community differently? So I don't know. I would just say get creative when we get tight in terms of our resources so that we can do the best and be the best. Don't just take anything that happens. Say, I want to be strategic. We want to be creative in terms of where we go.
Thank you. Dr. Bailey, how would you encourage everyone to stay informed and involved?
I totally echo what you're saying in terms of being creative and thinking outside the box. And that is one of the silver linings of downturns. In fact, Aikta, I'm sure you know this, we've had over 4 million new businesses formed in the US during this pandemic. That's a good thing. And, the theory is usually about 50% of them, die within the first few years. But, the theory is that maybe that's not the case this time, because a lot of the people who started these small businesses maybe had a job before and a side hustle. And when they lost their job, they started the side hustle as a true business and as something that they were doing full time. And with that, you get a lot of innovation too. So there are definitely some positives here. In terms of what else can individuals do, I think that, I tell this to my kids, and I have to remind myself to do it as well. Really inform yourself, and even with some sources that maybe you don't usually go to, especially younger cohorts. I mean, they're so used to snippets of information, and I know I sound old, but the reality is these are complex issues. And, you're not going to get answers from headlines, or from 2 bullet points underneath a headline. So, really inform yourself about what the policies are that are out there, and also use that information, arm yourself with that information from both the left and the right, and the North and the South, and then vote. And that way you're informed in what you're doing, and you're really participating in this process during, I think, what is a really pivotal time, probably the most pivotal of our lifetimes.
Excellent. Aikta?
We're here at Pomar, and I'm a product of Pomar, Emerging Leaders Program. I think many of you may be as well. Having your voice heard is incredibly important. There's a number of opportunities in our community to become civically engaged. And there's committees, there's commissions, there's boards. There are so many opportunities to have your voice heard on something that's important, but more importantly, be engaged with things you're not comfortable with. For me, it's housing. That's why they answered that question. I'm not the expert, but I have to insert myself in some of the hardest situations so that I understand some of the most important topics. So being civically engaged, serving your community on boards and understanding what what's happening out there and the solutions that are being talked about is incredibly important. And that's for small business owners that I hear about, like, I don't know why they're creating this legislation. I don't know this. Guess what? You have an opportunity to create that legislation and have a voice on those too. So just be civically engaged, have your voice heard, be in uncomfortable places, and represent who you are as often as you can.
Eric.
So I'm a Black man, as you can see.
No, you're not.
Okay. But I'm disappointed because I don't see me in the audience. And, inclusion goes both ways. And I think that I'm a firm believer in opportunity, giving anyone the opportunity to get engaged and get involved in the community. Sitting on the planning commission for 7 years, I saw the city separate. The North did something else, the West did something else, and the South had its own personality. And I think at the end of the day, we all needed to come together as a community. But it's intimidation, maybe, I'm not sure. It's something that hasn't brought us together as a community. Again, I grew up in Cleveland. There's no, sorry to say, hoods or ghettos in Colorado Springs. It's just not. And so I don't understand the division. But there is a bright side to that. She talked about civic engagement, Aikta. And there's a civic engagement program that I started working with Pomar Foundation about 7 years ago with the city council. It's called the Colorado Springs Civic Engagement Program. And this program gives you the opportunity to shadow any city board or commission. Now, what does that do for you? That educates you on what we're doing, how we do it. Like you said, it's not in a Gazette, it's not in an Indy, but you get an upfront look at the decisions that's being made. And I started that because it wasn't a lot of me or women on the city planning commission. So I think giving people the opportunity to serve, getting them engaged, and bringing this community together is how we should make this work. And I'm just, again, I'll keep those efforts up to maybe get this crowd a little more diversified in the future. So,
Yes. Tony, final thoughts?
I would say start with a yes. I think much too often, and it's, really on my mind right now around how many times opportunities come and there is a hard solution at hand or something that might take a little work and people go, nah, not into it, or that sounds like too much work. How do we as a community start with a yes and then work our way to a no? So whether that be from, a space of resources or a space of, inclusion and diversity or a space of whatever, start with a yes, and how do we get to a no? We did a great trip through the regional leaders trip with the EDC chamber and went to Boise, and this is probably 5 years ago. Was that right? You were there with me, weren't you?
Charleston.
No, well, anyway. Point being, I was wrong. Zero data over here, if you haven't noticed. Just anecdotes and jokes. So on that trip, it was interesting. Everyone said, you ask who they are, and they're like, oh, we're Boise Nice. And then, I came back home and I was asking all my friends, what are we? And there's no unifying identity of what is Springs. There's no, unifying identity that drives us in a direction to say, do we want big businesses or small businesses? Do we want local versus big box? Do we want roads or do we want to vote on X? And in a lot of ways, I just keep coming back to, communities that lean into hard issues have said yes first. And via that process, come to an identity that they can all rally around. And I think, there aren't a lot of solutions that we can just make in silos and by it being individuals, but it is through a process of leaning into yes, and then figuring out who we actually want to be. And again, I think, to spin it back positive, like you said, we just have an enormous opportunity as a city to do things better, to learn from our peer group, and to not miss those pieces of opportunity, whether that be affordability, infrastructure. I can't talk about infrastructure enough. You didn't ask me that question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I failed.
And how do we build, again, like my world has changed, so much since having kids, and I just look and I go, I want this place to be better for them than it was for me. And that means worldwide as well as locally. And so, I would say start with a yes.
Excellent. Join me in thanking the panel. So before I turn over the mic, I know the panel would agree with me. We owe a big thanks to Matt Carpenter and also to Kyle Hibble and the whole Pomar Foundation for putting this on tonight. It's excellent. But I would love for Megan Sanders and Dylan Craddock to stand up. These are the two fellows that put things together. And I just want to tell you, some of us that are a little bit older, we get a little sometimes thinking, where's the future headed with today's generation? It's in great hands. I'm very impressed with the Fellows program with these two young women, and I can't wait to see what you two do in the future. I turn it back over to you, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnna. Again, to our panelists, thank you. Amazing insights. I learned everything from jobs or people. I will share my acorns now, I promise. And a lot of intentionality and a lot of encouragement for all of us to get involved. So now is the fun. Again, thank you to the panelists and to Johnna. We have some time. We have some refreshments. Please look to your left, look to your right, maybe in front of you, maybe behind you. Find someone you don't know. Say hello. have a little discussion about the future of Colorado Springs and start thinking about what we can all do to be engaged. Thank you so much. Enjoy your evening.